My name is Sophia Ashby, and 12 years ago, I gave everything I had to Whitmore v. Slade Financial Partners. 12 years of early mornings and late nights, of missing birthday dinners and canceling vacations, of answering emails at midnight because I genuinely believed that loyalty and hard work were currencies that would eventually pay out. I believed in the company. I believed in my team. And for a long time, I believed in my boss, Diane Whitmore. That belief cost me more than I care to admit. But what Diane didn't count on, what she never saw coming, was that I'm not the kind of woman who disappears quietly. I started at Whitmore v. Slade fresh out of college, 22 years old with a finance degree from Fordham and enough ambition to light up all of Manhattan. The firm was a mid-size investment advisory based in Midtown, 34th floor of a glass tower on Park Avenue, the kind of place where you could smell the money the moment you stepped off the elevator. Diane Whitmore was a co-founder and the firm's chief investment officer. She was sharp, polished, and utterly magnetic in a room. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person she'd ever spoken to, and I fell for it completely. I wanted to be her. I wanted to learn from her. I wanted to make her proud. For the first 8 years, things were good. Not perfect. There were long stretches of grinding work and moments where I wondered if I was being taken advantage of, but I was climbing. I made senior analyst at 27, which was faster than almost anyone in the firm's history. By 30, I was heading my own small team in the risk assessment division. Diane praised me in meetings, CC'd me on high-level correspondence, told me more than once that I was the best hire she'd ever made. I held on to those words like they were something precious. I probably should have looked more carefully at the hand holding them out to me. The cracks began to show about 3 years into those 12, though I didn't understand what I was looking at yet. Our firm had a major institutional client, a nonprofit foundation called the Hargrove Family Trust, which managed charitable endowments for arts programs across New York and New Jersey. The Hargrove account was significant. We're talking about a portfolio in the tens of millions, conservative investment strategy, low-risk vehicles designed to protect long-term charitable giving. My team didn't manage the account directly. That sat with Diane and a small inner circle, but I processed quarterly risk assessments on it as part of my division's standard reporting. The first thing I noticed was a discrepancy in the allocation reports. It was small, the kind of thing that could easily have been a rounding error or a formatting issue, but something about it nagged at me. A set of figures in the trust's bond holdings didn't match what had been filed in the previous quarter's documentation. I flagged it internally to our compliance coordinator, a man named Greg Sutton, and he told me not to worry about it. Diane's team handles Hargrove directly, he said. They've got it sorted. I accepted that answer. I shouldn't have. Over the next year and a half, I kept running across things that didn't sit right. Figures that shifted between internal documents and client-facing reports. Fees that appeared in one spreadsheet and vanished in another. Communications about the Hargrove account that would sometimes be routed through my team by mistake, clearly intended for Diane's private distribution list, and which I would forward along without reading too closely because that's what a trustworthy employee does. I was, above all things, trustworthy. What changed everything was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I was staying late to finish a quarterly summary, the office mostly empty, the city glittering 34 floors below me. A junior analyst on my team, a young woman named Becca, had accidentally saved a file to a shared internal drive that was meant for Diane's division only. Becca panicked and asked me to delete it before anyone noticed. I opened the drive to find the file, and what I saw alongside it stopped me cold. There were folders, dozens of them, labeled with client codes and date ranges. Most were locked, requiring credentials I didn't have. But one folder hadn't been properly secured, and when I clicked it, it opened. Inside were a series of internal memos, transfer records, and a document that appeared to be a shadow ledger, a parallel set of accounts that tracked movements of money in and out of the Hargrove Trust that bore almost no resemblance to the official reporting I had been signing off on for years. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I took out my personal phone and photographed every page on that screen. I closed the folder. I deleted Becca's file. I said goodnight to the security guard on my way out, and I walked 4 blocks in the October cold before I let myself feel the full weight of what I had just seen.
I didn't sleep that night.
I sat at my kitchen table in my apartment in Astoria with a cup of tea I never drank, going back through everything, every discrepancy I had flagged and been waved off, every meeting where Diane had redirected questions about the Hargrove account, every time Greg had told me to stay in my lane. The picture that assembled itself was ugly. Diane Whitmore, the woman I had admired and defended for 8 years, appeared to be systematically siphoning money from a charitable foundation. And based on the dates in those documents, she had been doing it for a very long time. The question I faced that night, the one that kept circling back no matter how I tried to think around it, was what I was going to do about it. I want to be honest with you about how complicated that question felt. Diane wasn't just my boss. She was the reason I had a career. She had championed me when I was nobody, had put my name in front of people who mattered, had personally advocated for every promotion I'd received. There was a version of me sitting at that kitchen table that wanted very badly to close the folder in my mind the same way I had closed it on that drive, and just keep going. But I kept thinking about the Hargrove Foundation. I had read enough about them over the years to know what they did. Arts education programs in underserved communities throughout the tri-state area, after-school music and theater for kids who would never have access to it otherwise. The money that was missing from those accounts wasn't an abstraction. It was instruments that didn't get purchased, programs that got quietly cut, kids who got told there wasn't funding this year. I couldn't unknow what I knew, and I couldn't live with myself if I pretended I didn't know it.
So I made a plan.
And I want to be very clear that I did not move quickly. What I did over the next 4 months was slow, methodical, and careful in a way that I had never applied to anything in my life before, because I understood that if I got this wrong, I wasn't just risking my job. I was risking everything, and Diane had the kind of resources and connections that could make a person's professional life simply disappear. The first thing I did was consult an attorney. I found a lawyer named Carol Finch who specialized in financial whistleblower cases, and I met with her at her office in Murray Hill on my lunch break, telling no one where I was going. Carol was direct and methodical, which was exactly what I needed. She told me I had potential exposure under the SEC whistleblower program, that if the fraud involved securities violations, which it almost certainly did, given the nature of the accounts, I could have significant legal protections and potentially financial ones as well. She also told me that how I had obtained the photographs might be scrutinized, and that from that point forward, every step I took needed to be documented and deliberate. I left her office feeling less alone than I had in weeks. The second thing I did was keep working. Normally.
Competently.
With a smile on my face and nothing in my eyes that Diane could read as anything other than the reliable, dedicated Sophia she had always known. This was the hardest part. I sat across from her in meetings and watched her present numbers to clients and talk about fiduciary responsibility with a completely straight face, and I matched her performance with one of my own. I have never been a particularly good actress, but fear is a remarkable teacher. What I was doing underneath that surface was building a file. Every document that crossed my desk relating to the Hargrove account, I copied and retained according to the protocols Carol had outlined. I documented every meeting where the account was discussed. I began quietly cross-referencing the firm's public regulatory filings with what I knew from the shadow ledger, and the gaps I found were not small. Over 4 months, working alone in the evenings on a personal laptop that never touched the firm's network, I assembled a record that told a coherent and damning story. I also found out that I wasn't the only one who had seen something. About 2 months into my investigation, I had started thinking of it that way. As my investigation, I had a conversation with a colleague named Pete Darnell, who worked in the firm's operations division. Pete and I had always gotten along well, the kind of work friendship built on shared eye rolls during long meetings. We were eating lunch near Bryant Park when he mentioned, very carefully, that had a strange experience a few months back. Had been asked to process a wire transfer for the Hargrove account that hadn't matched any authorization he could find in the system, and when had raised it with his supervisor, had been told to process it anyway and not document his question. Pete had documented it anyway, quietly because Pete had good instincts. Had just had no idea what to do with what had found. I told him to get a lawyer. I didn't tell him what I knew, but I referred him to Carol, and I let Carol take it from there. A few weeks later, Pete became a second whistleblower attached to the same complaint. Carol said having corroboration changed everything. The moment I had been building toward came in February on a Thursday morning. The firm's quarterly board meeting, a gathering of Whitmore v. Slade's 7 board members, 2 external auditors, and several of the firm's largest institutional clients, including a representative from the Hargrove Foundation itself, was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the 22nd floor conference room. I had been included on the attendee list in my capacity as head of risk assessment, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the folder I was carrying, printed and organized by Carol's paralegal the night before, containing 112 pages of documentation. I had coordinated with Carol and with the SEC's Enforcement Division, which had been quietly reviewing our submission for 6 weeks. 2 investigators from the SEC were waiting in the lobby of the building that morning. A representative from the Manhattan DA's office was in contact with Carol by phone. Everything was in place. I had rehearsed what I was going to say so many times that the words felt worn smooth, like stones from a river. Diane opened the meeting the way she always did, confidently, warmly, with that particular quality of command that had impressed me so much when I was 22. She reviewed the quarter's performance, praised several members of the team, made a light joke about market volatility that got polite laughter from around the table. I sat near the end of the conference table with my folder in front of me and my hands completely still, and I waited for the agenda to reach the client portfolio review. When it did, when Diane clicked to the Hargrove Foundation slide and began describing what she characterized as strong performance and careful stewardship, I raised my hand. Diane looked at me. There was a flicker of something in her expression, not alarm, just mild surprise, because I rarely interrupted her in board settings. "Sophia," she said, with a smile that was mostly reflex. "Go ahead." "I need to raise a concern," I said. "About the Hargrove account specifically." I kept my voice level. I had practice level. "I've identified significant discrepancies between the internal accounting records and the figures being presented to the board and the client today, and I believe the board needs to see this documentation before we go any further." The room went very quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture to it, that you can feel against your skin. Diane's smile stayed on her face for approximately 2 seconds longer than was natural, and then it changed into something harder. "I think this might be better addressed in a separate." "I don't think it can wait," I said, and I stood up and began distributing the folders I had prepared. 1 for each board member. 1 for each auditor. 1 for the Hargrove Foundation representative, a silver-haired man named Walter Crane who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table and who went absolutely still when I set the document in front of him. What followed was not dramatic in the way you might imagine. There was no shouting. Diane did not make a scene. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, more devastating than any confrontation I could have scripted. The board members began reading. Walter Crane turned pages with a controlled, deliberate stillness that told me he was working very hard to keep his face neutral. One of the external auditors pulled out his phone within 30 seconds and stepped out of the room. Diane sat at the head of the table and said nothing, and the nothing she said grew heavier with every passing minute. One of the board members, a man named Richard Osei, who I had always respected, looked up from the document and asked Diane directly if she had an explanation for the transfer records on page 47. Diane said that the documents were being taken out of context and that she would need time to review them with counsel before responding to any questions. Richard looked at her for a long moment and then looked back down at the page. The meeting was suspended at 9:53. By 10:15, building security had been asked to accompany Diane to her office, while the board convened an emergency session with their own legal counsel. The SEC investigators, who had been notified the moment I distributed the folders, came up from the lobby. Carol arrived with Pete's documentation. I sat in a small side room with a cup of coffee someone had thought to bring me, and I answered every question I was asked as completely and carefully as I could. I was in that building until nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Diane Whitmore was escorted out of 375 Park Avenue at 11:47 that morning. I know the exact time because I watched it happen from the window of that side room, 34 floors up, looking down at the street below. 2 investigators, 1 on each side. Diane in her good wool coat, her head up, her posture still impeccable. Whatever else I thought about her in that moment, I recognized that she was holding herself together with considerable discipline. The door of the car closed. The car pulled away. And I stood at that window for a long time after it was gone. The weeks that followed were not easy. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this sometimes skip over the complicated part, the part where doing the right thing doesn't feel like triumph so much as it feels like exhaustion. There were depositions and interviews and hours of conversations with lawyers. There were people at the firm who were angry at me, who felt that I had destroyed something they'd invested years in, and a few of them said so directly. Greg Sutton, the compliance coordinator who had told me not to worry about it all those years ago, turned out to have known considerably more than he had let on. He lost his position. He blamed me for it. I let him. He was steadier through all of it than I expected. We had a lot of very long phone calls in those months, the two of us processing what we'd done and what it had cost, and am grateful for those conversations in a way I still find hard to fully articulate. He had a young daughter and a mortgage and a great deal to lose, and he had done the right thing anyway. There's a particular kind of bond that forms between people who've been through something like that together. We're still in touch. The Hargrove Foundation received a settlement. I can't speak to the exact figures, but Carol told me it was substantial enough to restore what had been taken, and then some. The foundation's director made a public statement about the importance of institutional accountability. I read it in my apartment early on a Sunday morning and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry through any of the hard parts. Maybe because it finally felt like something was actually over. As for me, the SEC whistleblower program operates on a provision that awards a percentage of sanctions collected in cases like mine to the individuals who brought the information forward. I don't talk about the specifics publicly and am not going to here, but I will tell you that it was enough to change my life in practical terms. Enough to take time before deciding what to do next. Enough to remind me that the system, when it works, can actually work. I spent about 6 months doing almost nothing. I walked a lot. I read things I'd been putting off for years. I went back to Fordham one afternoon just to walk around campus. Not for any particular reason, except that I wanted to feel like the 22-year-old who had started all of this. Not because she had been wiser than the woman I became, but because she had believed so completely that honesty was worth something. I wanted to make sure I still believed that. I do.
Fully.
Without reservation. Whatever it cost me, I would do it again. I'm in a different role now. Consulting work, mostly for nonprofits and smaller institutions that need help building the kind of internal oversight structures that should have existed at Whitmore v. Slade. I find the work genuinely meaningful in a way that surprises me sometimes because I didn't expect to find meaning in systems and compliance frameworks. But when you've seen what happens when those frameworks are absent, when you've watched money meant for children's art programs get quietly redirected into someone's personal enrichment, the work of building better safeguards stops feeling abstract. It feels like the most concrete thing in the world. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry. At Diane, at the firm, at the years I spent being loyal to something that didn't deserve it. And the honest answer is that the anger burned off a long time ago, replaced by something that I don't have a perfect word for, a kind of clarity, maybe. A knowledge of who I am when things get hard. Diane Whitmore thought she knew me well enough to trust that I would stay in my lane, stay grateful, stay quiet. She had been watching me for 8 years, and she still didn't see me clearly. That, in the end, was her most expensive mistake. 12 years. That's how long I gave to that place, to that woman, to that version of myself that needed to be needed and approved of. I don't regret the work, because the work made me good at what I do. I don't even entirely regret the loyalty, because it showed me something about my own character that I hadn't fully tested before. What I know now, what I carry with me every single day, is that integrity isn't something you perform in the easy moments. It's what you do at 10 o'clock at night in an empty office when nobody is watching, and the easiest thing in the world would be to close the folder and go home. I didn't close the folder. And I would not trade that for anything.